In the early 1830s, American investors poured millions into natural rubber. New England factories began mass-producing waterproof coats, mailbags, and life preservers for a public eager to stay dry. But the new industry had a wall. The raw material was completely at the mercy of the seasons. By July, warehouses full of expensive inventory became disaster zones. A rubber boot that looked perfect in April would sweat in the summer heat, eventually collapsing into a dark, sticky puddle. As it melted, it rotted. Decomposing rubber releases a sulfurous stench so heavy that neighbors protested the factory smells, and customers found their raincoats had essentially glued themselves shut. Before rubber could build tires or gaskets, it was an unstable, rotting commodity that wiped out every major investment in the industry. To understand the failure, you have to look at the source. This is natural rubber, a milky liquid called latex bleeding from a Heva brasiliensis in the Amazon. At its core, this fluid is a suspension of polysoprene, a polymer built from long, tangled chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms. Indigenous tappers collected this liquid and smoked it over open fires. The heat and smoke coagulated the latex into solid balls so it could be transported out of the jungle. But getting it to American or British factories meant a weeks-long ocean voyage. High temperatures inside the ship cargo holds caused these heavy masses to soften, fuse together, and grow surface mold. By the time a shipment arrived, manufacturers weren't dealing with a neat industrial material. They were trying to process a giant, sticky, irregular mass of organic matter. In 1820, English inventor Thomas Hancock faced a specific bottleneck. Raw rubber scraps were too stubborn and irregular to be blended or shaped into reproducible products. His solution was a hand-cranked machine he secretly called the masticator. The intense mechanical friction generated inside this iron cylinder physically tore the rubber apart. This created enough heat to soften the scraps, forcing them to fuse together into a warm, uniform mass. Thomas Hancock's machine made it possible to slice, press, and shape rubber for mass production. But brute force was only a mechanical fix. The finished product still melted the moment the temperature rose. Charles Goodyear was a bankrupt hardware salesman from Connecticut with no formal scientific training. He spent years mixing raw rubber with anything he could find, toxic acids, quicklime, and even cream cheese. He inhaled dangerous fumes, pawned his children's school books, and frequently ran his experiments from a debtor's prison. In 1839, he dropped the mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot cast iron stove. Instead of liquefying, the material charred at the edges. When it cooled, the charred edge remained firm, dry, and flexible. Goodyear had been mixing sulfur into rubber for years, but the heat of the stove forced the two materials to bond. This bond changed the rubber at a molecular level. In its raw state, natural rubber consists of loose, sliding chains of polysoprene. When the temperature rises, the weak forces holding them together break, and the chains slide past each other like melting plastic. But when sulfur atoms react under intense heat, they break apart and attack reactive sites on those sliding chains. The sulfur forms permanent bridges, physically connecting one polysoprene chain to another. Now, even as the temperature fluctuates, the entire network holds its shape. This process is vulcanization. It converts rubber from a temperature-sensitive liquid into a thermoset plastic, a material that sets permanently into its shape and cannot melt. This accidental chemical locking mechanism provided the molecular architecture that allowed the modern industrial age to scale. This triumph triggered a brutal supply chain shift. Brazilian barons claimed vast stretches of the Amazon, enslaving tens of thousands of indigenous tappers to meet global demand for tires and belts. To break the Brazilian monopoly, the British Empire smuggled 70,000 seeds out of South America to establish massive, highly organized plantations across Southeast Asia. By 1941, the United States relied entirely on that Asian supply. When Japanese forces captured those plantations after Pearl Harbor attack, the American military economy hit a breaking point. Tires were rationed, even before gasoline. To survive the war, the U.S. launched a massive crash program to scale synthetic rubber production. But even these synthetic versions relied entirely on the sulfur chemistry Charles Goodyear discovered on that stove. World War II proved that a distant supply chain for a critical material is a major geopolitical vulnerability, not just a logistical hurdle. This 19th century shortage mirrors modern supply chain failures. The sudden, dangerous scarcity of masks, ventilator parts, and surgical gloves during the COVID-19 pandemic exposed a similar reliance on specialized overseas manufacturing. The high-performance natural rubber required for aircraft tires and medical devices still comes from Southeast Asia, and nearly all these trees are clones descended from seeds smuggled out in 1876, leaving the global supply vulnerable to a single fungal pathogen. The men who built this process paid heavily. Charles Goodyear died hundreds of thousands in debt, receiving nothing from the success of the companies that later adopted his name. Building the modern world required dangerous obsession and immense human cost. 2 centuries after a bankrupt salesman dropped sulfur onto a stove, we are still navigating the exact same fragile dependencies on materials we barely control.